Disgraced judge left her fortune to a stranger. Her greedy family fought back. The gavel slammed down for the final time as Judge Emily Myers stripped off her black robes, her hands trembling with rage and betrayal. 23 years of service destroyed by one headline. Her own children circled like vultures, demanding their inheritance before her body was even cold. But Emily had one last case to rule on, her own. The will she signed that morning would teach them the true meaning of justice. They had no idea what was coming. Emily Myers had always believed that justice was about second chances. For 23 years, she'd sat behind the bench in downtown Portland, watching broken lives parade before her. Addicts whose hands shook as they stood before judgment, teenage thieves with defiant eyes hiding scared hearts, desperate parents who'd made terrible choices trying to feed their children. The fluorescent courtroom lights had witnessed thousands of stories, but Emily never forgot that behind every case number was a human being capable of change. While other judges focused on punishment, Emily focused on redemption. Her colleagues preferred the clean simplicity of jail time and fines. Emily preferred the messy complexity of community service, drug rehabilitation programs, and innovative sentencing that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Her desk was always cluttered with follow-up reports, success stories, and thank you letters that most judges never bothered to read. Her drug court program had the lowest recidivism rate in the state. Former addicts who'd appeared before her bench were now counselors, teachers, and productive members of society. The community service sentences she crafted turned angry vandals into neighborhood beautification volunteers. Her rehabilitation-focused approach made headlines for all the right reasons, until it didn't. The autumn morning when everything changed started like any other. Emily arrived at the courthouse at 7:30, as she had for decades, carrying her worn leather briefcase and the thermos of coffee that May Banks, her court clerk, always prepared perfectly. The familiar routine of reviewing cases, checking on previous defendants' progress, and preparing for the day's hearings felt as natural as breathing. Then Maria Santos called. Maria was an investigative journalist who'd been working on a series about judicial corruption in Oregon's court system. Emily had agreed to an interview because she had nothing to hide. Her record was impeccable, her ethical standards beyond reproach. She'd expected to discuss her innovative programs, maybe share some success stories about defendants who'd turned their lives around. Instead, Maria's questions focused on something Emily had never considered controversial: her use of personal funds to support defendants who couldn't afford legal representation. Judge Myers, our investigation shows you've personally funded legal aid for over 200 defendants in the past decade. Can you explain this practice? Emily had answered honestly, without recognizing the trap she was walking into. Yes. She'd used her substantial inheritance from her parents to quietly ensure that defendants had proper representation. Yes, she'd sometimes paid for rehabilitation programs when state funding was insufficient. Yes, she'd personally guaranteed bail for defendants she believed deserved a chance to get their lives together before trial. Everything Emily had done was technically legal, but Maria's article made it sound suspicious, inappropriate, even corrupt. The headline read, "Portland Judge's Secret Financial Involvement with Defendants Raises Ethical Questions." The story painted Emily as a judge who'd crossed professional boundaries, whose emotional involvement with cases had compromised her objectivity. The morning the article published, Emily's phone started ringing before dawn. Reporters wanted comments. The Portland Bar Association wanted explanations. The State Judicial Commission wanted a formal response to what they termed concerning allegations of judicial misconduct. But the most devastating call came from her son, Richard. "Mother, what the hell were you thinking?" His voice carried the cold fury he usually reserved for opposing counsel. "Do you have any idea what this does to my firm? My clients are already asking questions about my judgment for not controlling my own mother's behavior. Emily sat in her kitchen, still in her bathrobe, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. Richard, I helped people who needed help. Everything I did was legal and stupid are two different things, Richard interrupted. You've made us all look like fools. Lisa's already getting calls from her friends asking if you've lost your mind. The conversation that followed revealed a chasm Emily hadn't known existed. Her children weren't concerned about whether she'd done the right thing. They were concerned about how her choices affected their reputations, their social standing, their financial futures. Richard worried that clients would question his judgment. Lisa worried that her husband's family would distance themselves from the scandal. Neither of them asked whether Emily was okay. The scandal exploded across Portland's legal and social circles like wildfire fed by autumn winds. Emily's colleagues, who'd once praised her innovative approaches, suddenly remembered concerns they'd allegedly harbored for years. Bar association members whispered about her concerning pattern of boundary violations. Social acquaintances who'd once sought her advice about their children's legal troubles now avoided eye contact at the country club. Emily's world, built carefully over 2 decades, began crumbling with breathtaking speed. The Portland Tribune ran follow-up stories examining Emily's entire judicial record through the new lens of inappropriate emotional involvement. Cases she'd been proud of, the young mother she'd sentenced to parenting classes instead of jail, the teenager she'd required to mentor younger kids instead of serving time in juvenile detention, were reframed as examples of judicial overreach. The governor's office issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about the allegations and promising a thorough review of Emily's conduct. The State Judicial Commission announced a formal investigation that could result in her removal from the bench. Emily watched 23 years of dedicated service transform into a cautionary tale about judges who cared too much. But the deepest wound came from her children's reaction. Richard and Lisa weren't rallying to support their mother. They were positioning themselves to minimize damage to their own lives. If you've ever felt betrayed by the people you loved most, hit that like button. This story is for you. Lisa called 3 days after the initial article, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mother, we need to talk about damage control. Richard's firm is considering asking him to take a leave of absence until this dies down. My husband's family is suggesting I distance myself from you publicly. Distance yourself from me? Emily repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. Just temporarily until the scandal passes. Maybe you could make a public apology, accept some kind of censure, and retire quietly. Then in a few years, when people have forgotten, we can repair our relationship. Emily stared out her kitchen window at the garden where she'd raised her children, where they'd played on swings David had built with his own hands, where they'd celebrated birthdays and graduations and all the milestones that had once seemed to bind them together permanently. Lisa, are you asking me to apologize for helping people? I'm asking you to be realistic about the situation you've created. The conversation ended with Lisa hanging up when Emily refused to commit to public contrition for actions she still believed were right. Emily sat in her empty house surrounded by photos of happier times and realized that her children had become strangers, people who shared her DNA but none of her values. The cracks beneath Emily's composed surface ran deeper than anyone realized. She'd spent decades building bridges between rigid legal structures and human compassion, believing that justice was most powerful when it included the possibility of redemption. She'd used her position not for personal gain, but to ensure that the scales of justice weren't tilted against the poor, the addicted, the desperate. Now those same bridges were burning, and Emily was being painted as either naive or corrupt, depending on who was telling the story. Her Victorian home felt enormous and hollow, filled with the ghosts of conversations that would never happen again. The dining room where she'd hosted Richard's law school graduation celebration echoed with memories of Lisa's wedding, planning sessions. Every room held evidence of the family she'd thought she was building, a family united by love and shared values. Emily's belief system, carefully constructed over decades of service, was crumbling like old mortar. She'd always believed that doing the right thing would be rewarded, that integrity was its own protection, that her children would eventually understand and appreciate her principles. She'd believed that families were bound together by something stronger than convenience or financial interest. The investigation proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency that felt like slow torture. Emily was required to submit financial records documenting every dollar she'd spent on defendant support. She had to justify each decision to fund legal representation, each payment for rehabilitation programs, each instance where she'd used personal resources to level the playing field for people who couldn't afford justice. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being investigated for making the legal system more fair. Emily's law clerk, May Banks, remained loyally at her side throughout the ordeal. May had worked in the courthouse for 30 years, serving under 12 different judges, and she'd never seen anything like Emily's dedication to individual defendants' success. "Judge Myers," May said during one of their quiet conversations in Emily's chambers, "I've watched you stay late every night for 20 years, writing thoughtful sentencing memos and following up on cases other judges forgot the moment they closed the file. You're the only judge I've ever worked for who remembered my grandson's name, asked about my anniversary, and treated me like family instead of furniture." May's words provided some comfort, but they couldn't stop the avalanche of consequences that followed the scandal. The Portland Bar Association was calling for Emily's resignation. The governor was facing increasing pressure to remove her from the bench. Community organizations that had once praised her programs were distancing themselves from association with her name. Most painful of all, Richard and Lisa had stopped calling entirely, except through their lawyers inquiring about Emily's estate planning and the status of their expected inheritance. Emily realized they were already treating her like she was dead, dividing her estate while she was still alive to witness their greed. The storm on the horizon was bigger than her resignation, bigger than the destruction of her reputation. It was the complete dismantling of everything she'd believed about family, loyalty, and what it meant to live a life of meaning. Emily had always thought her legacy would be the lives she'd changed, the second chances she'd provided, the innovative programs that had helped hundreds of people rebuild their lives. Instead, her legacy was becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of caring too much. The investigation continued. Her children circled like vultures, and Emily faced the possibility that everything she'd worked for would be remembered as the foolish idealism of a judge who'd lost sight of proper boundaries. But deep in her heart, despite the pain and betrayal surrounding her, Emily couldn't bring herself to regret the choices that had led to this moment. She'd helped people who needed help. She'd used her privilege to create opportunities for those who had none. She'd believed in the possibility of human redemption when everyone else had given up. The question wasn't whether she'd made the right choices. It was whether she had the strength to face the consequences of those choices when everyone she'd trusted most had abandoned her. Chapter 2. The breaking point arrived on a gray November morning that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Emily had called Richard and Lisa to her home, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of their relationship before her inevitable resignation. She'd spent hours preparing their favorite meal, pot roast with the vegetables Lisa had loved as a child, the dinner rolls Richard used to steal from the cooling rack before they made it to the table. Emily set the dining room table with her mother's china, the delicate blue and white pattern that had graced 3 generations of family celebrations. She polished the silverware until it gleamed, arranged fresh flowers from her garden, and lit the candles that had witnessed so many important conversations in this room. She'd practiced what she would say about values, about family loyalty, about the difference between reputation and character. She'd prepared gentle explanations about why her work mattered, why helping defendants was an extension of love rather than a betrayal of it. She'd hoped that in the intimacy of their childhood home, surrounded by memories of better times, they might remember who they used to be. Richard arrived first, his BMW purring in the driveway like a satisfied predator. He wore his most expensive suit, the one he reserved for hostile takeovers and contentious divorces. His briefcase was larger than usual, bulging with what Emily would soon learn were documents designed to strip her of autonomy. Lisa arrived moments later in her husband's Mercedes, her designer heels clicking against the flagstone walkway with the rhythm of approaching judgment. She clutched her purse like armor, her face carefully composed in an expression of long-suffering concern that didn't reach her eyes. Neither child hugged their mother. Neither asked how she was coping with the stress of the investigation, the loneliness of professional isolation, the pain of watching her life's work be dismantled in newspaper headlines. They moved through Emily's house like strangers, evaluating property they intended to inherit. They sat across from Emily at the mahogany dining table where they'd once celebrated Christmas mornings and birthday surprises, their faces cold and calculating. The beautiful meal Emily had prepared sat untouched between them, growing cold as the conversation grew colder. "Mother, we need to discuss your financial situation," Richard began, his lawyer voice in full effect, the tone he used to intimidate opposing counsel into settlements they didn't want to accept. "This scandal has compromised your position, and we're frankly concerned about your decision-making capacity." Emily's heart sank like a stone dropped into deep water. She'd invited them for reconciliation, but they'd come for something else entirely. "I asked you here to talk about our family, not my finances." "They're related," Lisa interjected, her voice sharp with barely concealed anger that had been building for weeks. "Your poor judgment has embarrassed our entire family. Richard's firm is losing clients because partners don't want to be associated with your scandal. My husband's family is reconsidering their support for my charity work because they don't want the family name connected to judicial misconduct." Emily looked at her daughter. This woman who'd once brought her wildflowers picked from the backyard, who'd cried in Emily's arms after her first heartbreak, who'd asked for her mother's advice about everything from college majors to wedding dress styles. Now Lisa sat rigid with resentment, treating Emily's compassionate service as a personal attack on her social standing. "Your charity work?" Emily asked quietly. "You mean the charity work you do 2 hours a month for the photo opportunities?" Lisa's face flushed with fury. "Don't you dare judge my contributions. At least I understand appropriate boundaries. At least I don't throw money at criminals and call it justice." The conversation deteriorated with brutal efficiency. Richard produced documents from his briefcase, legal papers suggesting Emily transfer her assets to a trust managed by him for her own protection. The paperwork was already prepared, requiring only her signature to strip her of financial autonomy. Lisa demanded Emily liquidate her investments immediately to minimize damage to the family's reputation. She'd apparently consulted with financial advisors about the fastest way to convert Emily's assets to cash that could be distributed before further scandal erupted. Neither child expressed concern for Emily's emotional state, her professional devastation, or her need for support during the most difficult period of her life. They spoke about her future as if she were already dead, dividing her possessions like estate executors, settling a will. "You're talking about my death like it's a business transaction," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. "Don't be dramatic," Lisa replied with the dismissive tone she'd perfected as a teenager. "We're being practical. You've already proven you can't be trusted with money. Look what your so-called charity has cost us all." The final blow came when Richard casually mentioned they'd already consulted with estate attorneys about challenging any will that didn't reflect normal family obligations. He said it as if he were discussing the weather, as if threatening to contest their mother's final wishes was just another item on his legal to-do list. "You mean you'll challenge any will that doesn't give you the maximum possible inheritance?" Emily said, her composure finally cracking like ice under pressure. "We're protecting our family's future from your increasingly poor judgment," Richard replied smoothly. "You're clearly not thinking clearly about consequences." Emily stared at her children, these strangers who shared her DNA but none of her values, who'd been raised in her home but had learned nothing about her principles. Her emotional reaction was swift and overwhelming. 23 years of trying to balance her integrity with their expectations crashed down on her like a building collapse. The denial she'd maintained about their fundamental differences evaporated in that moment. She could no longer pretend that their disapproval stemmed from concern for her well-being. She could no longer hope that patient explanation would help them understand her choices. She could no longer sacrifice her principles to maintain relationships that existed only on their terms. The anger she felt wasn't just about their greed, it was about her own blindness to who they'd become, her own complicity in enabling their selfishness, her own failure to recognize that they'd been evaluating her worth based on her utility to their lives rather than loving her for who she was. After they left, taking their unsigned documents and their threats with them, Emily sat alone in her dining room surrounded by the untouched meal and her shattered illusions. The candles had burned down to stubs, the flowers were wilting, and the beautiful table setting looked like the remnants of a funeral no one had attended. The early consequences of recognizing this painful truth were immediate and brutal. Emily couldn't call Richard and Lisa her children anymore. They were adversaries who happened to share her last name. She couldn't pretend their relationship could be salvaged through compromise or patience. She couldn't continue sacrificing her integrity for people who had no respect for it and no love for the person she actually was. The first risky action Emily took was small but significant. She called her estate attorney and scheduled an appointment to completely revise her will. Not to include Richard and Lisa more generously as they expected and demanded, but to reconsider whether they deserved any inheritance at all from a woman whose values they openly despised. The resistance began immediately and escalated quickly. When Richard learned about the attorney appointment, small-town legal circles were notorious for gossip. He called Emily in a fury that stripped away his professional facade and revealed the entitled, angry man beneath. "Mother, if you make any rash decisions while you're under investigation, we'll challenge every penny in court. We'll drag this family through years of litigation. We'll make sure everyone knows exactly how far you've fallen from grace." Lisa's approach was more manipulative, but equally threatening. She showed up at Emily's house unannounced the next day, alternating between crocodile tears and barely veiled threats. She claimed Emily was destroying the family out of spite, that she was punishing her own children for trying to protect her from herself. But Emily had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. For the first time in decades, she was prioritizing her own values over her children's expectations. The feeling was terrifying and liberating simultaneously, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you could either fall or learn to fly. Emily's first attempts at standing up for herself came in small but important ways. When Richard pressured her to resign immediately rather than face the formal removal hearing that was being scheduled, Emily refused. "Mother, you're making this worse for everyone. Just resign with dignity and let us handle the aftermath. We can manage the media, control the narrative, minimize the damage to the family reputation." For the first time in years, Emily said no. "Richard, if they want me removed from the bench, they'll have to follow proper procedures. I won't make it easy for them to erase 23 years of dedicated service without a fight." The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. Richard wasn't accustomed to his mother refusing his legal advice or rejecting his strategy for managing her life. "You're being selfish," he finally said, his voice tight with frustration. "This affects more than just you. My career is suffering because of your stubbornness." "Everything I've ever done has been about more than just me," Emily replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That's exactly the problem. I've spent so many years considering everyone else's needs that I've forgotten to consider my own values." The immediate consequences of her new assertiveness were swift and punishing. Richard's phone calls stopped entirely. Lisa began spreading carefully crafted stories about Emily's increasing mental instability at social gatherings, painting herself as a devoted daughter, struggling to care for a mother who was losing touch with reality. Their unified front was designed to pressure Emily back into compliance, to make her so uncomfortable with conflict that she'd return to her old patterns of people-pleasing accommodation. Instead, their campaign revealed something important. They had never valued Emily for who she was, only for what she could provide and how well she could conform to their expectations. Emily began defending herself in ways that surprised everyone who knew her. When reporters called asking about her resignation timeline, instead of deflecting or declining comment, she spoke honestly about her judicial record and the programs she'd created. When the Portland Bar Association scheduled her disciplinary hearing, she decided to represent herself rather than hire an attorney to negotiate a quiet settlement. Chapter 3. These new behaviors created immediate pushback from people who'd grown comfortable with Emily's accommodating nature. Former colleagues advised her to take the graceful exit rather than fighting removal proceedings. Legal friends suggested she was making things worse by refusing to accept quiet resignation. The governor's office hinted through intermediaries that a voluntary retirement would be better for everyone involved. But Emily discovered something unexpected. Defending her principles felt better than protecting her reputation. Each time she refused to back down, each time she chose authenticity over approval, she felt stronger rather than more isolated. The fear she'd carried for decades, the fear of disappointing people, of being rejected, of standing alone, was losing its power over her decisions. Maybanks became Emily's strongest ally during this difficult period. As Emily's former court clerk, May had witnessed 23 years of Emily's compassionate judgments and innovative programs. She'd seen Emily stay late into the evening, writing thoughtful sentencing memos that most judges would have delegated to staff. She'd watched Emily follow up on defendants years later, checking on their progress, celebrating their successes, grieving their failures. May had witnessed Emily's quiet tears when someone she'd tried to help ended up back in the system, and her radiant joy when former defendants sent updates about completed education, stable employment, successful recovery from addiction. "Judge Myers," May said during one of their coffee meetings at a small cafe near the courthouse, her weathered hands wrapped around her cup for warmth. "I've worked for 12 different judges in my 30-year career. You're the only one who ever asked about my grandson's struggles with addiction. You're the only one who remembered my wedding anniversary every year and sent flowers when my husband died. You're the only one who saw defendants as complete human beings instead of case numbers to be processed." May's support helped Emily realize that her colleagues' criticism wasn't about her professional competence. It was about their discomfort with her approach to justice. Her children's rejection wasn't about her failure as a mother. It was about their fundamental disagreement with her values and their resentment that she wouldn't compromise those values for their social comfort. This growing clarity led Emily to make her most dangerous decision yet. She began researching Elena Gonzalez, a young woman whose case had crossed her courtroom 5 years earlier. Emily remembered the case with unusual clarity. Elena had been arrested for drug possession, but something in her eyes had reminded Emily of her own children at that age. Before, disappointment and entitlement had hardened their hearts. Instead of the jail time that other judges routinely imposed for similar offenses, Emily had sentenced Elena to community service and mandatory counseling. She'd personally recommended a rehabilitation program that focused on addressing underlying trauma rather than just punishing drug use. Emily had even quietly paid Elena's program fees when it became clear that state funding wouldn't cover the cost. Emily had never followed up on Elena's case. Judicial ethics discouraged ongoing relationships with former defendants. But something compelled her to investigate now, driven by a need to understand whether her compassionate approach had actually made a difference in someone's life. What Emily discovered would change everything she thought she knew about the impact of her work. Elena had not only completed her rehabilitation successfully, but had gone on to earn her GED, then her bachelor's degree in social work, then her master's degree in addiction counseling. She now ran a nonprofit organization helping other women escape addiction, domestic violence, and homelessness. Her program had helped over 200 women rebuild their lives in just 3 years of operation. Emily sat in her study late one evening, reading about Elena's work on her laptop, and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: pure, uncomplicated pride in her judicial decisions. Here was concrete proof that her approach worked, that giving people second chances could create expanding ripples of positive change that touched hundreds of lives. Elena's nonprofit, called Second Sunrise, operated on the same principles Emily had tried to bring to her courtroom: that people were more than their worst mistakes, that compassion was more powerful than punishment, that the right intervention at the right moment could change the entire trajectory of someone's life. The program's success rates were extraordinary. 85% of women who completed Second Sunrise's residential program remained clean and sober 2 years later. 70% found stable employment. 60% were reunited with their children. These weren't just statistics. These were lives transformed, families healed, communities strengthened. Emily read testimonials from women who'd graduated from Elena's program, stories that sounded familiar because she'd heard similar stories in her courtroom for decades. Women who'd lost everything to addiction, who'd made desperate choices to survive, who'd been written off by family members, employers, and society itself. Women who'd found hope and healing through programs that treated them as human beings worthy of redemption. The resistance to Emily's new self-advocacy was intensifying daily, but so was her commitment to authenticity. Her children were consulting with estate attorneys, preparing to challenge any will that didn't maximize their inheritance. Her colleagues were pressuring her to resign, quietly to avoid further embarrassment to the judicial system. The media was calling her a disgraced judge, whose career would be remembered primarily for scandal rather than service. But Emily was beginning to understand that dignity didn't come from other people's approval. It came from living according to her own values, regardless of the cost. The most important question wasn't whether she could repair her relationships or save her reputation. It was whether she had the courage to finish her judicial career on her own terms, even if it meant standing completely alone. Emily's practice victories began small but grew more meaningful with each success. When the Portland Tribune called asking for a comment on her impending resignation, instead of declining to speak, Emily spent an hour on the phone detailing the success rates of her rehabilitation programs, the innovative approaches that had reduced recidivism, the lives that had been transformed through compassionate justice. The resulting article was more balanced than previous coverage, focusing on Emily's track record of innovation rather than just the ethical questions surrounding her personal financial involvement with defendants. Several defense attorneys were quoted praising Emily's approach. Social workers described her programs as groundbreaking. Former defendants shared stories about how her sentences had changed their lives for the better. The forced confrontations escalated when Emily was required to address the Portland Bar Association about her case. Instead of sending a written statement or having an attorney speak on her behalf, Emily surprised everyone by requesting to address the full assembly in person. Standing before 200 of her peers in the association's grand meeting room, many of whom had been whispering about her for weeks, Emily spoke with a clarity and conviction that commanded attention despite the hostile atmosphere. "I've spent 23 years believing that justice without compassion is just revenge with a gavel," she told the packed room, her voice steady and strong despite the sea of skeptical faces before her. "I've used my position to ensure that defendants, especially poor defendants, had access to the same opportunities for rehabilitation and redemption that wealthy defendants take for granted. I won't apologize for seeing people as human beings worthy of second chances." The room was dead silent. Emily could see some colleagues shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others openly glaring at her with disapproval. But scattered throughout the audience, she noticed younger attorneys, public defenders, and social workers in the gallery, nodding in agreement with her words. "You call my approach inappropriate," Emily continued, her confidence building as she spoke her truth. "I call it justice. You worry about boundaries and proper procedure. I worry about whether our legal system is actually serving the people it's supposed to protect. The question isn't whether I followed every bureaucratic guideline. It's whether my approach made our community safer, healthier, and more just." When Emily finished speaking, the applause was scattered and polite. But it was applause nonetheless. More importantly, several younger attorneys approached her afterward, expressing support for her methods and asking for advice about incorporating similar approaches into their own practices. Richard learned about Emily's speech from news coverage and called immediately, his voice tight with fury. "Mother, you're committing professional suicide. Stop making speeches and start planning your exit strategy. You're making this infinitely worse for everyone." "I'm not exiting anything until I'm forced out," Emily replied, her newfound strength evident in every word. "And I'm certainly not going quietly to protect your reputation or anyone else's comfort with conventional thinking. This isn't about my reputation, it's about basic common sense. You're destroying what's left of our families standing in this community." "No, Richard. This is about you being embarrassed that your mother has principles you don't share, values you don't understand, and courage you don't possess." The brutal honesty of Emily's words hung in the air between them. When Richard hung up without responding, Emily knew they'd crossed a point of no return in their relationship. She felt sadness at the loss, but also relief at finally speaking truth that had needed to be said for years. Emily's moments of self-doubt were real and painful, usually hitting her late at night when the house was quiet and her thoughts turned inward. Sitting in her study, surrounded by legal books and case files from her career, she questioned whether fighting was worth the enormous cost she was paying. She was losing her family, her colleagues' respect, and possibly her entire legacy. Maybe Richard and Lisa were right. Maybe she should take the graceful exit, accept a quiet resignation, and spare everyone further embarrassment. Maybe her approach to justice really was naive idealism rather than principled innovation. But these moments of weakness were consistently followed by reminders of why she'd become a judge in the first place. Letters began arriving at her home from unexpected sources. Former defendants who'd seen news coverage of her situation and wanted her to know how her compassion had changed their lives. Marcus Williams, a young man she'd sentenced to community service instead of prison 7 years earlier, sent a handwritten letter that brought tears to Emily's eyes. He was now a college graduate working as a counselor for at-risk youth, helping other young people avoid the mistakes that had brought him to her courtroom. "You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself," Marcus wrote in careful script. "You gave me a chance when everyone else saw only my mistakes and my criminal record. I think about that day in your courtroom every time I help. Another kid who's made bad choices but still deserves a future. Your belief in me saved my life, and now I get to help save other lives. Thank you for showing me that one person's compassion can change everything." Similar letters began arriving as word spread through networks of former defendants, their family members, social workers, and defense attorneys. People shared stories about how Emily's approach had prevented family breakups, enabled people to keep their jobs while completing alternative sentences, and provided opportunities for genuine rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Emily realized she'd been so focused on her family's disappointment and her colleagues' criticism that she'd forgotten about the people who truly mattered, the ones whose lives had been transformed by her willingness to see beyond their worst moments and invest in their potential for change. Chapter 4. The build-up to Emily's first empowerment peak came when she made her boldest decision yet. She called Elena Gonzalez directly. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number she'd found on Second Sunrise's website, unsure how a former defendant would react to contact from the judge who'd sentenced her years earlier. "Ms. Gonzalez, this is Judge Emily Myers. I don't know if you remember me, but I presided over your case 5 years ago." Elena's voice was warm and genuinely surprised, carrying none of the resentment or awkwardness Emily had feared. "Judge Myers, of course I remember you. You changed my life completely. I've been following the news about your situation. I'm so sorry you're going through this. It's completely unfair." "I was wondering if we could meet," Emily said, her heart pounding with the audacity of what she was contemplating. "I'd like to learn more about what you've been doing since your case, about the work you're doing now." They arranged to meet at a small cafe in downtown Portland, away from the courthouse and the legal circles where Emily's reputation was being dissected daily. Emily arrived early, nervous about stepping so far outside judicial protocol and uncertain about what she hoped to accomplish through this meeting. When Elena walked through the cafe door, a confident young woman in professional attire, carrying herself with quiet dignity and purpose, Emily felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with her own accomplishments and everything to do with Elena's transformation. Elena was 32 now, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her clothing simple but well chosen. She moved with the self-assurance of someone who'd found her calling and was fully committed to it. The scared, defiant young woman who'd stood before Emily's bench 5 years earlier had evolved into someone who radiated competence and compassion. They ordered coffee and found a quiet corner table where they could speak privately. Elena told her story simply and powerfully, without self-pity or dramatic flourishes. Her arrest had been a wake-up call. But Emily's sentencing approach had been the crucial turning point that made recovery possible. "I was so angry when I came to your courtroom," Elena said, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her eyes distant with memory. "I'd been written off by everyone, my family, my friends, social services, the other judges I'd appeared before. Everyone saw me as just another junkie, another statistic, another lost cause taking up space in the system." Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But you looked at me differently. You looked at me like I was worth saving, like I was a person instead of just a problem to be disposed of. That look, that moment when you saw potential instead of just mistakes, that changed everything for me." Emily felt tears building as Elena described her journey through recovery and education, the difficult early days of sobriety when every morning felt like climbing a mountain, working multiple minimum wage jobs while attending community college classes at night, the constant struggle against self-doubt and the temptation to return to old patterns when life became overwhelming. "There were so many times I wanted to quit," Elena admitted. "School was harder than I'd expected. I was older than most of the other students and I felt like I didn't belong in college classrooms. But whenever I thought about giving up, I remembered that day in your courtroom when you sentenced me to community service instead of jail time." Elena had completed her community service at a women's shelter, where she discovered her calling working with other women struggling with addiction and trauma. The shelter director had encouraged her to pursue formal education in social work, even helping her apply for scholarships and financial aid. "You didn't just give me a second chance," Elena said, her voice filled with quiet emotion. "You gave me back my future. You showed me that someone believed I could become more than my worst mistakes. That belief became the foundation for everything I've built since then." Elena went on to describe her current work with Second Sunrise. The nonprofit had grown from a small program serving 12 women to a comprehensive organization helping over 200 women annually. They provided residential treatment, job training, educational support, and long-term mentoring to help women rebuild their lives after addiction, domestic violence, or homelessness. "Every woman I help, I think about that day in your courtroom," Elena said. "You didn't just save my life. You gave me the tools to help save other lives. The compassion you showed me, I now get to show to women who are where I used to be. It's like your kindness keeps multiplying, reaching people you'll never meet, but whose lives are better because of the choice you made to believe in me." As Emily listened to Elena's story, she felt her resolve crystallizing like water, freezing into unbreakable ice. This was what real impact looked like. This was the kind of legacy that actually mattered. Her children might never understand it. Her colleagues might disapprove of it. The media might ridicule it, but this transformation of one life into hundreds more, this was worth fighting for. Elena shared specific stories about the women Second Sunrise had helped. Maria, a former addict who was now a certified nurse working in a rehabilitation hospital. Jessica, who'd escaped domestic violence and was now studying law to become an advocate for other abuse survivors. Amanda, who'd been homeless with 2 young children and was now a manager at a nonprofit housing organization. "These women don't just get clean and find jobs," Elena explained, her passion evident in every word. "They become leaders in their communities. They mentor other women going through similar struggles. They break generational cycles of trauma and addiction. Your decision to show me mercy created ripple effects that are still spreading, touching lives in ways you could never have imagined." Emily felt something she hadn't experienced since the scandal broke. Absolute certainty that her approach to justice was right. The criticism from colleagues, the investigation by the Bar Association, the threats from her children, all of it paled in comparison to the evidence sitting across from her of how compassionate justice could transform not just individuals, but entire communities. The first empowerment peak arrived that evening when Emily sat down with her estate attorney, Margaret Chen, and made the decision that would define the rest of her story. She was going to leave the majority of her substantial fortune not to Richard and Lisa, but to Elena Gonzalez and her nonprofit organization. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Emily?" Margaret asked, her professional composure unable to hide her surprise. "This will almost certainly be challenged in court. Your children won't understand, and they'll have grounds to contest based on the unusual nature of the bequest." Emily smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling lighter and more purposeful than she had since the scandal began. "Margaret, my children lost the right to understand my decisions when they started treating my life like their business opportunity. This choice feels more right than anything I've done in years." Emily spent 2 hours with Margaret, restructuring her entire estate. The house would go to Elena to serve as a residential facility for women in recovery. The bulk of her investments and savings would fund Second Sunrise's expansion plans. Her art collection and personal belongings would be donated to organizations that had supported her judicial programs over the years. She left Richard and Lisa each $50,000. Enough to acknowledge the biological relationship, but not nearly enough to support the lifestyle they felt entitled to inherit. "I want to include a letter to be read at the will reading," Emily told Margaret. "Something that explains why I made these choices so there's no confusion about my reasoning or my mental state." That night, Emily sat in her study writing the letter that would become her final statement about family, legacy, and what it meant to live according to your values. She wrote about the difference between blood relatives and chosen family, about the responsibility that comes with privilege, about the kind of inheritance that actually matters. For the first time since the scandal broke, Emily felt like herself again. Not the people-pleasing mother trying to maintain impossible relationships, not the reputation-conscious judge worried about criticism, but the woman who believed deeply in second chances and the transformative power of compassion. The fight that was coming would be brutal. Richard and Lisa would challenge the will, question her mental competency, and drag her name through additional rounds of public humiliation. But Emily was finally ready for that battle because she was fighting for something she believed in rather than against something she feared. The hidden truth that would change everything came wrapped in an innocent phone call 3 weeks later. Mae Banks called Emily on a rainy Thursday morning with news that seemed routine at first. Maria Santos, the investigative journalist who'd inadvertently triggered Emily's downfall, wanted to do a follow-up story. She says she's been getting calls from people who want to share stories about your impact as a judge, Mae explained, her voice carrying excitement Emily hadn't heard in months. Apparently, your case has generated more positive response mail than any story she's written in her career. Emily agreed to meet Maria, curious about these mysterious supporters and wondering if positive coverage might help counterbalance the negative narrative that had dominated the news for months. What Emily discovered in that coffee shop meeting would expose a truth that had been hidden from her for decades. Maria arrived with folders full of letters, emails, and phone interview transcripts. Judge Myers, I had no idea when I wrote that original story what kind of response it would generate. I thought I was writing about judicial ethics and boundary issues. I had no idea I was writing about someone who'd been quietly changing lives for over 2 decades. The letters were from people Emily barely remembered. Defendants who'd appeared in her courtroom years earlier, their family members grateful for sentences that had led to rehabilitation rather than just punishment, social workers who'd implemented her innovative programs, defense attorneys who'd watched her transform the local justice system one case at a time. But the revelation that would shatter Emily's understanding of her own story came from an unexpected source. Her late husband David's personal files that Mae had discovered while helping Emily organize her home office. Emily, I found something I think you need to see, Mae said, producing a worn manila folder from her purse. This was in David's desk, in the back of the bottom drawer. I almost threw it away, but something made me look through it first. Inside were copies of letters David had written, but never sent. Letters to Richard and Lisa explaining their mother's work, defending her choices, pleading with them to understand her dedication to justice and compassion. The letters dated back 15 years, revealing that David had been fighting this battle with their children long before Emily realized how deep their disapproval ran. One letter to Richard, written 8 years earlier, was particularly devastating. Your mother stays awake at night, worrying about defendants who appear in her courtroom. She uses her own inheritance to fund legal representation for people who can't afford it because she believes everyone deserves competent counsel. She follows up on cases years later to see if her interventions worked, celebrating successes and grieving failures like they were family members. You call her naive. I call her extraordinary. I've watched her save dozens of lives through her compassionate approach to justice. I just wish her own children could see what I see. The personal loss hit Emily like a physical blow to her chest. David had been protecting her from their children's criticism for years, absorbing their complaints and trying to build bridges she didn't even know had been burned. He died 3 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, taking with him his role as buffer between Emily's principles and her children's expectations. Emily sat in Mae's living room, reading letter after letter that David had written, defending her work to their own children. He documented their criticism, their resentment, their demands that Emily conform to more conventional judicial approaches. He'd tried repeatedly to help them understand that their mother's compassion was a strength, not a weakness, but the most devastating revelation was yet to come. At the bottom of the folder was a letter David had written to Emily herself, apparently intending to give it to her after his retirement. It was dated just 3 weeks before his fatal heart attack. My darling Emily, the letter began in David's careful handwriting, I know the children don't understand your work, and I know their disapproval hurts you more than you admit to me. But I need you to know something important. You are the most principled person I've ever known. Your compassion has changed hundreds of lives in ways you may never fully realize. Don't ever let anyone, not the Bar Association, not the media, not even our own children, convince you that your approach to justice is wrong. You are living proof that the legal system can work with both heart and wisdom. I am so proud to be your husband. Chapter 5. Emily sat in her kitchen that evening, reading David's final letter to her through tears that felt like they might never stop. He'd known. He'd always known that she would eventually have to choose between her family's approval and her principles. He'd been preparing her for this moment without her realizing it, building her strength for a battle he knew was coming. The point of no return came that same evening when Richard and Lisa arrived unannounced at Emily's house. They'd heard rumors about Maria Santos's follow-up story and were furious about the positive coverage their mother was receiving. Their faces were tight with anger as they pushed past Emily into her living room. "This media rehabilitation needs to stop," Richard declared, his lawyer mask finally slipping to reveal the entitled, controlling man beneath. "These feel-good stories are just prolonging your embarrassment and ours. You need to resign immediately, accept responsibility for your poor judgment, and let this scandal die down." "I've read some of the letters people are sending to that reporter," Lisa added, her voice sharp with resentment. "These people are just grateful they didn't go to prison. That doesn't make what you did appropriate or ethical." Emily looked at her children, really looked at them, and saw strangers wearing familiar faces. They were incapable of understanding that justice could be about redemption rather than punishment, that true success was measured in transformed lives rather than harsh sentences, that compassion was a form of strength rather than weakness. "Your father knew this day would come," Emily said quietly, David's letter still clutched in her hands like a shield against their judgment. "What day?" Richard demanded, his impatience evident in every tense line of his body. "The day when I would have to choose between your approval and my integrity." The major betrayal that pushed Emily to her absolute breaking point came when Lisa revealed the strategy they'd been developing with their legal team. They'd been quietly building a case that Emily was mentally incompetent to make financial decisions, gathering evidence of what they called her increasingly erratic behavior. "We're trying to protect you from yourself," Lisa said with false sweetness that didn't hide the steel beneath. "And we're protecting our family's future from your increasingly poor judgment and unstable decision-making. You're trying to have me declared mentally incompetent because I won't give you my money on your preferred timeline," Emily said, her voice steady with a new kind of fury that felt clean and powerful. "We're preventing you from making decisions you'll regret when you're thinking more clearly," Richard replied, with the condescending tone he used on hostile witnesses. "Your recent behavior suggests you're not capable of managing your own affairs responsibly." Emily stood up from her chair, David's letter still in her hand, and felt something shift inside her permanently. The woman who had spent decades trying to balance everyone's needs, trying to keep peace at any cost, trying to earn love through endless accommodation. That woman was gone forever. In her place stood someone who finally understood that some relationships weren't worth saving, that some people couldn't be loved into becoming better versions of themselves, that integrity mattered more than harmony. "Get out of my house," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Mother," Lisa began, her false concern cracking to reveal the panic beneath. "Get out now and don't come back unless you're invited, which you won't be." The argument that followed was brutal and final. Richard accused Emily of mental illness exacerbated by grief and professional humiliation. Lisa sobbed dramatically about Emily choosing strangers over her own blood, about destroying the family out of spite and confusion. They both threatened continued legal action, public humiliation, and permanent estrangement. They spoke as if these were punishments that would bring Emily to her senses, not recognizing that they were offering her freedom from relationships that had become toxic and destructive. When they finally left, slamming the door behind them like petulant teenagers, Emily sat alone in the sudden quiet of her home and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. She was no longer fighting to preserve relationships that had been broken for years. She was no longer trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it unconditionally. That night, Emily made a phone call that would change 2 lives forever. "Elena, it's Judge Myers. I have a proposition for you that might sound sudden, but I've been thinking about legacy lately, and I've realized that some gifts should go to people who can do the most good with them, not necessarily the people who share your DNA." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and was life-changing for both women. Emily explained her decision to leave Elena the majority of her estate, her reasoning based on Elena's proven commitment to helping other women transform their lives. Elena was initially overwhelmed, then deeply moved, then excited about the possibilities such a gift could create. They talked about expanding Second Sunrise's programs, opening additional residential facilities, creating scholarship funds for women pursuing education after recovery. "Judge Myers," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion, "I can't adequately express what this means, not just the financial support, but your belief in the work we're doing. You're giving me the resources to help hundreds more women find their way back to life." When Emily hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the scandal began: excitement about the future. She was no longer fighting to preserve her past or repair broken relationships. She was fighting to build something meaningful and lasting with her remaining time and resources. If you believe in second chances and the power of compassion, smash that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. About a time someone believed in you when no one else did. The legal battle that was coming would be brutal and public. Her children would challenge the will with every resource at their disposal, questioning her mental competency and dragging her name through additional scandal. The media would have a field day with the story of a disgraced judge leaving her fortune to a former defendant. But Emily had finally found her cause worth fighting for, and it wasn't her reputation, her family relationships, or her social standing. It was her legacy of compassion, embodied in Elena's work and the hundreds of lives they could transform together. The consequences of Emily's choice reached their most painful point 3 weeks after she'd rewritten her will. Richard and Lessa had made good on their threats, filing legal documents questioning her mental competency and demanding immediate conservatorship of her finances to protect her from her own impaired judgment. The local media had picked up the story with obvious relish, turning Emily's family drama into public entertainment that sold newspapers and generated clicks. "Judge's children claim she's mentally ill," read the headline in the Portland Tribune, accompanied by a photo of Emily looking haggard and defeated outside the courthouse. The story painted Emily as an unstable woman, making irrational decisions while facing professional disgrace and personal isolation. Worse, it included carefully selected quotes from former colleagues who suggested that Emily's recent behavior indicated she might be struggling under pressure and not thinking clearly about consequences. Emily sat in her study on a gray November morning, reading the article for the 3rd time, feeling the isolation press down on her like a physical weight. The people she'd considered friends were either actively undermining her credibility or maintaining conspicuous silence that spoke volumes about their loyalty. Her own children were publicly declaring her mentally incompetent, willing to humiliate her in the most public way possible to get what they wanted. The career she'd built over 2 decades was being systematically dismantled, piece by people who'd once claimed to respect her judgment. The internal battle was tearing Emily apart with its intensity. Her old self, the the mother who'd always prioritized family harmony above personal needs, the judge who'd cared deeply about colleagues' respect and public approval, was screaming that she should capitulate before the damage became irreversible. Give Richard and Lisa what they wanted. Accept the quiet resignation everyone was urging. Restore the will to traditional family lines that everyone would consider normal and appropriate. Stop fighting battles she couldn't win against people who had more resources and less scruples than she did. But the new Emily, the one who'd been awakened by David's letters and strengthened by Elena's story, refused to surrender principles she'd spent a lifetime developing. This Emily knew that backing down now would betray everything she'd worked for, everyone she'd helped, and the memory of the husband who'd believed in her courage even when their own children didn't. The moment of near surrender came during the disciplinary hearing that would determine whether Emily would be removed from the bench or allowed to retire with some dignity intact. Emily was required to sit in a courtroom where she'd once presided, listening to former colleagues testify about her concerning pattern of boundary violations and inappropriate emotional involvement with defendants. The hearing felt more like a trial, with Emily cast as the criminal rather than the judge she'd been for over 2 decades. The testimony was damaging and relentless, painting her compassionate approach to justice as evidence of impaired judgment rather than innovative thinking. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a respected psychiatrist, had been hired by Richard and Lisa to testify about Emily's mental state. She'd never met Emily personally, but she'd reviewed media coverage, legal filings, and secondhand accounts of Emily's behavior. Based on the documentation provided and the pattern of behavior described, Dr. Hoffman testified with professional authority, Judge Myers appears to be exhibiting signs of late-life crisis exacerbated by professional stress and personal loss. Her recent decision to disinherit her children in favor of a former defendant suggests significantly impaired judgment that could be consistent with early cognitive decline or severe depression. Emily sat in the witness gallery listening to her own children's hired expert declare her mentally incompetent based on newspaper articles and legal briefs. The humiliation was complete and devastating. She was watching her reputation, her career, and her family relationships die simultaneously in a public forum that would be reported in tomorrow's newspapers. That evening, Emily sat in her empty house and seriously considered surrender for the first time since this battle began. She could call her attorney in the morning, restore the will to favor Richard and Lisa, accept a quiet resignation that would end the media attention, and try to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of her life. Her children might forgive her if she capitulated completely. Her colleagues might respect her more for backing down gracefully. The media attention would die down, and she could live out her remaining years in quiet anonymity, remembered as someone who'd had good intentions but poor judgment. She could go back to being the Emily everyone expected her to be, gracious, accommodating, and ultimately powerless to live according to her own values when they conflicted with other people's comfort. Chapter 6. The thought made Emily physically ill. She walked through her house looking at photos from what she'd once considered happier times, Richard's law school graduation where he'd thanked her for her unwavering support, Lisa's wedding where she'd called Emily her role model and inspiration, family holidays when they'd all pretended their values were aligned. Emily realized she was mourning not just her current relationships with her children, but the illusion that those relationships had ever been real. Her children had loved her conditionally, based on her compliance with their expectations rather than acceptance of who she actually was. Her colleagues had respected her only as long as she didn't challenge conventional thinking too dramatically. Even some of her friendships had been based more on social convenience than genuine connection or shared values. The Emily who'd spent decades trying to earn everyone's approval, trying to keep everyone comfortable with her choices, trying to avoid conflict at any cost, that woman was dying. It felt like grieving her own death, letting go of the person she'd been in favor of someone she wasn't sure she had the courage to become. The lowest point came when May Banks called with devastating news. The State Judicial Commission had voted to recommend Emily's removal from the bench, and the governor would likely accept their recommendation within days. 23 years of dedicated service would end in professional disgrace and public humiliation. "I'm so sorry, Emily," May said, her voice thick with tears of frustration and sadness. "They didn't even consider your service record or the hundreds of support letters that have been pouring in. They just focused on the scandal and the family drama about your mental competency." After May hung up, Emily sat alone in her study and wept for everything she was losing: her career, her family relationships, her standing in the community, the life she'd thought she was building. She questioned everything. Had her approach to justice really been innovative and effective, or just self-indulgent idealism? Had she helped people, or just convinced herself she was helping to feel better about her unconventional choices? Was her decision to leave money to Elena really about principle and legacy, or just revenge against children who disappointed her? Maybe Richard and Lisa were right. Maybe she was losing her grip on reality, making emotional decisions that would embarrass everyone and accomplish nothing positive. The darkest thoughts came at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come, and her mind turned to worst-case scenarios. Maybe her whole career had been built on naive idealism rather than sound judgment. Maybe her colleagues were right to question her methods. Maybe her family was right to worry about her mental state. But even in her darkest moment, Emily couldn't escape one undeniable truth. Elena Gonzalez was thriving. Marcus Williams was helping other young people avoid his mistakes. The dozens of letters from former defendants told stories of transformed lives, rebuilt families, and second chances that had become lifetime achievements. Emily might be losing everything else: her reputation, her family relationships, her professional standing, but she couldn't deny the concrete evidence of her positive impact on individual lives. The question wasn't whether she'd made a difference in the world. The question was whether that difference was worth the enormous cost she was paying now. As dawn broke over Portland, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded Emily why she'd fallen in love with this city decades earlier, she made a decision that would define her final stand. She wasn't going to surrender to pressure from her children, her colleagues, or her own fears. She wasn't going to restore the will or accept quiet resignation, or apologize for living according to her principles. She was going to fight for her legacy, even if she lost everything else in the process. The woman who'd spent decades seeking approval from others was gone forever. In her place stood someone who finally understood that integrity wasn't about what other people thought of your choices. It was about whether you could live with yourself when you looked in the mirror. The final battle was about to begin, and Emily was finally ready for it. The antagonist struck hardest on the morning Emily was scheduled to appear at the conservatorship hearing that would determine whether Richard and Lisa could gain control of her finances. They had assembled an impressive legal team, complete with medical experts, financial advisors, and character witnesses, ready to testify that their mother was incompetent to manage her own affairs. Emily arrived at the courthouse alone, having declined May's offer to accompany her. This was her fight, her moment to stand up for her right to live according to her own values, regardless of whether anyone else understood or approved of those values. The hearing was devastating in its clinical efficiency. Richard testified with surgical precision about his mother's erratic behavior, her financially irresponsible decisions, and her increasing social isolation following professional disgrace. He painted a picture of a woman losing touch with reality, making irrational choices out of spite, confusion, and unresolved grief. Lisa was more emotional but equally damaging in her testimony. She spoke tearfully about watching her mother deteriorate since her father's death, describing Emily's will changes as completely out of character for someone who had always prioritized family above everything else. Their star witness was Dr. Hoffman, who had now conducted a brief court-ordered evaluation of Emily. Her testimony was carefully worded but ultimately damning. While I cannot diagnose significant cognitive impairment based on limited contact, Judge Myers displays concerning patterns of decision-making that suggest compromised judgment, possibly related to stress, grief, and professional humiliation, affecting her ability to think clearly about long-term consequences. The financial advisor they'd hired presented charts and graphs showing Emily's reckless spending on defendant support programs over the years, framing her charitable giving as evidence of fiscal irresponsibility and poor judgment about money management. When Emily's turn came to defend herself, she stood at the witness stand and looked out at the packed courtroom. Her children sat in the front row, their faces carefully composed in expressions of loving concern that didn't reach their eyes. Behind them were reporters, curious colleagues, and a few scattered supporters, including May Banks, and, to Emily's surprise, Elena Gonzalez. Emily had prepared a lengthy defense of her financial decisions, her mental competency, and her fundamental right to distribute her wealth according to her own values and judgment. But when she opened her mouth to speak, what came out was something different, something more honest and powerful than any legal argument could ever be. Your Honor, my children are asking you to take away my autonomy because I've made choices they don't understand or approve of. They want you to declare me incompetent because I believe in second chances and redemption more than they do. They want control of my money because they think Elena Gonzalez is less deserving of it than they are, based solely on the fact that they share my DNA while she doesn't. Emily's voice grew stronger and more confident as she continued, the authority of truth giving power to her words. But here's what they don't understand, what they've never understood. Elena Gonzalez represents the best of what I've tried to accomplish in 23 years as a judge. She was broken and lost when she came to my courtroom, and she's now dedicated her life to helping other broken people heal and rebuild their lives. That's not fiscal irresponsibility. That's the highest possible return on investment. The courtroom was dead silent, hanging on every word. Emily could see Richard's jaw tightening with anger, Lisa's eyes filling with tears of fury and frustration. My children think I've lost touch with reality because I won't prioritize their financial expectations over my principles. But my reality is that I've spent my career watching human beings transform themselves when given genuine chances for redemption. My reality is hundreds of letters from people whose lives were changed by compassionate justice. My reality is that legacy isn't about preserving wealth for blood relatives. It's about using your resources to continue the work that gave your life meaning. Emily looked directly at Richard and Lisa as she delivered her final statement. I love my children, but I will not be declared incompetent for refusing to enable their greed and entitlement. I will not be manipulated into betraying my principles to buy back their approval. And I will not apologize for choosing to support someone who embodies everything I believe about the power of redemption and second chances. The judge, a younger woman Emily didn't recognize, deliberated for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. When she returned with her decision, her words were measured and careful, clearly aware of the media attention and legal precedent her ruling might set. The court finds insufficient evidence to support a finding of mental incompetency. Mrs. Myers has demonstrated clear understanding of her financial situation, logical reasoning for her estate planning decisions, and consistent adherence to values she has held throughout her adult life. However, given the unusual circumstances and legitimate family concerns, I'm ordering a 6-month monitoring period with quarterly financial reviews to ensure Mrs. Myers' continued capacity to manage her affairs independently. It was a partial victory that felt like a loss. Emily retained legal control of her finances and the right to distribute her estate as she chose, but under court supervision that would give Richard and Lisa opportunities to challenge every significant decision she made for the next 6 months. As Emily left the courthouse, Richard caught up with her on the marble steps, his carefully maintained professional composure finally cracking to reveal the angry, entitled man he'd become. "This isn't over, Mother. We'll challenge every penny you try to give away to that woman. We'll tie up your estate in court for years if necessary. Elena Gonzalez will never see a dime of that money. We'll make sure of it." Emily stopped walking and turned to face her son with complete composure. "Richard, you've spent so much energy trying to control my money that you never bothered to understand what actually matters to me. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you've chosen to become." Lisa joined them, her face flushed with fury and humiliation at the partial defeat they'd suffered. "You're destroying our family for a stranger, someone who means nothing to you. How is that the legacy you want to leave?" Emily felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity that had been building for months but was finally complete. "Elena isn't a stranger to me. She's proof that compassion works, that people can change, that second chances can create ripple effects of positive change. You two are my children, but you've become strangers to everything I believe in and everything I've tried to accomplish with my life." The health scare that would push Emily to her absolute breaking point came that same evening. The stress of the hearing, combined with months of family conflict and public humiliation, triggered what her doctor would later diagnose as a severe anxiety attack that mimicked heart attack symptoms. Emily collapsed in her kitchen, alone with her terror and her racing heart, thinking she might be dying with her legacy still in jeopardy and her principles still under attack. The chest pain was excruciating, the difficulty breathing terrifying, but worse than the physical symptoms was the fear that she might die before she could secure Elena's inheritance and prove that her life had been worth something. May Banks found her after Emily failed to answer her phone for hours. The ambulance ride to the hospital was Emily's darkest moment, not because she feared death, but because she feared dying before she could finish the work of living authentically according to her own values. In the hospital bed, connected to monitors and surrounded by the sterile smell of disinfectant and the constant beeping of machines, Emily faced her deepest fears about her choices. What if Richard and Lisa were right about her mental state? What if she was destroying relationships that could still be salvaged? What if Elena didn't deserve the trust Emily was placing in her? What if her entire approach to justice had been misguided idealism, rather than principled wisdom? The crisis reached its absolute peak when Richard and Lisa arrived at the hospital, not with flowers or concern for their mother's health, but with legal documents they wanted Emily to sign while she was thinking clearly about mortality and family priorities. "Mother, this health scare should be a wake-up call about what really matters," Lisa said, her voice falsely gentle as she placed papers on Emily's bedside table. "You need to think about your family, about the people who will actually be there for you in your final years." Emily looked at her children standing beside her hospital bed, documents in hand like vultures with contracts, and saw the final truth she'd been avoiding. They had never loved her unconditionally. Their love had always been contingent on her compliance with their expectations, her usefulness to their lives, her willingness to prioritize their comfort over her own values. "Get out," Emily said quietly, her voice hoarse from the breathing treatments but filled with unmistakable authority. "Mother," Richard began, his practiced concern slipping to reveal irritation at her continued resistance. "Get out!" Emily's voice was stronger than it had been in months, powered by a fury that felt clean and righteous. "Get out of my room, get out of my life, and don't come back. I am done pretending we have a relationship worth preserving." Chapter 7. The confrontation that followed was brutal and final. Richard accused Emily of mental illness exacerbated by grief and professional humiliation, claiming her hospitalization proved she couldn't handle stress or make rational decisions. Lisa sobbed about Emily choosing a stranger over her own blood, about destroying the family that had supposedly supported her through everything. They both threatened continued legal action, public humiliation, and permanent estrangement, speaking as if these were punishments that would bring Emily to her senses, rather than offerings of freedom from relationships that had become toxic and destructive. Emily listened to their threats with growing calm, realizing that she was no longer afraid of losing them because she had finally understood that she'd already lost the people she'd thought they were years ago. These angry, greedy strangers weren't her children. They were the people her children had chosen to become despite her love, her guidance, and her example. When they finally left, Emily was alone in her hospital room, but not lonely for the first time in months. She felt completely at peace with her choices, ready to face whatever came next: legal battles, public scandal, professional disgrace, because she was finally fighting for something that mattered more than their approval or anyone else's comfort with her decisions. The final test had been passed. Emily had chosen authenticity over acceptance, principle over peace, and meaningful legacy over family harmony. The cost was everything she'd once thought mattered, but what she'd gained was infinitely more valuable: herself. Emily's empowerment climax began not in a courtroom or family confrontation, but in a quiet moment of absolute clarity 3 days after her hospital release. She was sitting in her study, reading Elena's latest quarterly report about the women their nonprofit had helped, when she realized she was no longer fighting against her children's expectations. She was fighting for her own vision of what her life could mean. The moment she claimed her power came when Emily made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of hiding from the media attention that had been destroying her reputation, she was going to use it as a platform to tell her truth. Emily called Maria Santos directly. "I want to tell the whole story," she said, her voice steady with newfound purpose. Not just about the scandal or the family drama, but about what I've learned about justice, legacy, and what it means to live according to your values when everyone around you thinks you're wrong. The interview that followed became the most watched news segment in Portland's recent history. Emily sat in her living room, surrounded by photos and mementos from her judicial career, and spoke with an authority and peace that commanded attention despite the hostile climate surrounding her case. "People ask me if I regret my decision to leave my inheritance to Elena Gonzalez instead of my children," Emily said, looking directly into the camera with unwavering confidence. "They want me to say I was acting out of spite or grief or diminished mental capacity. But the truth is much simpler. Elena Gonzalez represents everything I hope to accomplish as a judge. She was broken when she came to my courtroom, and she's now dedicated her life to helping other broken people heal and rebuild their lives." Emily's voice grew stronger as she continued, her conviction evident in every word. "My children see my will as a betrayal of family loyalty. I see it as the ultimate expression of true family. Choosing to nurture and support someone who will carry forward the values that gave my life meaning, regardless of blood relationships or social expectations." The interviewer pressed Emily about the conservatorship hearing and her children's claims about her mental state. Emily's response was measured but powerful. "My children believe that blood relationship entitles them to my wealth, regardless of their values, their character, or their willingness to continue the work I've dedicated my life to. I believe that true inheritance is about perpetuating principles that make the world better, not preserving privilege for people who happen to be born into a family." The most powerful moment came when Emily addressed her children directly through the camera, her voice filled with sadness but also unshakable resolve. "Richard and Lisa, I love you both, but I cannot and will not compromise my integrity to buy back your approval. You are my biological children, but Elena Gonzalez has become my spiritual legacy." The response to Emily's interview was immediate and overwhelming. Her phone rang constantly with calls from former defendants, their family members, social workers, defense attorneys, and complete strangers who'd been moved by her story. The Portland Tribune received over 300 letters supporting Emily in the days following the broadcast. Legal aid organizations across the country reached out asking about Emily's innovative approaches to sentencing. Law schools invited her to speak about compassionate justice. Social work programs wanted her to consult on rehabilitation-focused interventions. But the real transformation was visible in Emily herself. When Richard and Lisa's attorneys filed additional challenges to her will, claiming the interview proved she was publicly humiliating the family and acting irrationally, Emily didn't retreat or become defensive. Instead, she hired her own legal team, not to negotiate a compromise, but to prepare for the fight with strategic determination and absolute confidence in her choices. The symbolic moment that represented Emily's complete empowerment came during the formal will reading, which Oregon law required despite the ongoing legal challenges. Emily had requested that the reading be held in the courthouse where she'd presided for over 2 decades, a location that carried deep meaning as the place where her life's work had unfolded. The scene was electric with tension and anticipation. Richard and Lisa sat with their expensive legal team, their faces carefully controlled masks of barely contained anger and entitlement. Elena sat quietly in the back with May Banks, still overwhelmed by the attention and uncertain about her role in this family drama that had consumed the local media for months. When Emily's attorney began reading the will, the monetary amounts weren't shocking. Everyone already knew Emily was leaving the majority of her substantial estate to Elena. The shock was the letter Emily had included to be read aloud, explaining her choices with devastating clarity. To my children, Richard and Lisa, I leave you each the sum of $50,000, not because you deserve less than Elena, but because you have already chosen wealth over values, status over character, and entitlement over empathy. This inheritance reflects what you've shown me about your priorities. I pray that someday you will understand that true inheritance isn't about money. It's about carrying forward principles that make the world more just and compassionate. Emily's letter continued with growing power. To Elena Gonzalez, I leave you the remainder of my estate not because you are more deserving than my biological children, but because you represent the possibility of redemption that gave my career meaning. You have already proven that second chances can create expanding ripples of positive change. I trust you to use these resources to continue transforming lives in ways that will honor both your journey and mine. The most powerful part of Emily's letter came in her final paragraph. To anyone listening to these words, I hope my story demonstrates that legacy is not about preserving wealth for blood relatives who happen to share your DNA. Legacy is about ensuring that your deepest values outlive your physical body. Elena Gonzalez will use this inheritance to help hundreds of women rebuild their lives, break cycles of addiction and violence, and become forces for positive change in their communities. That is the only monument to my life that I need or want. As Emily's attorney finished reading, Emily stood and addressed the room with complete composure. She no longer sought anyone's approval, understanding, or forgiveness. She was simply stating facts about her choices and their inevitable consequences. Richard and Lisa, you have spent the last 8 months trying to convince courts and the media that I'm mentally incompetent because I've chosen principle over your financial expectations. You've publicly humiliated me, questioned my sanity, challenged my right to make decisions about my own life and resources, and treated my legacy like your personal business opportunity. Emily's voice carried the unshakable authority of someone who had found solid ground to stand on after months of uncertainty. But you've also given me an unexpected gift, the absolute clarity that comes from understanding exactly who people really are when their financial interests are threatened. She turned to Elena with warmth that had been absent when she addressed her children. Elena, you didn't ask for this responsibility, but I believe you're prepared for it in ways that have nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. You've already transformed your own life and helped hundreds of others do the same. This inheritance will allow you to expand that work exponentially, creating ripple effects of healing and hope that will touch lives neither of us can imagine. The final symbolic act came when Emily removed her late husband David's wedding ring from her finger, a ring she'd continued wearing 3 years after his death as a connection to their shared values and love. David would have approved of this decision completely, Emily said, her voice soft with memory and certainty. He always believed that our highest calling was to help others become their best selves, to use our privileges and resources to create opportunities for people who had none. Elena, you embody that calling. Emily then turned to Richard and Lisa one final time. You are welcome in my life when you're ready to accept me as I am, rather than demanding I become who you want me to be for your convenience. Until that day, I wish you well, but I will not sacrifice my integrity or my legacy for your approval. Emily walked out of the courthouse that day as a completely transformed person. She was no longer the disgraced judge seeking redemption or the desperate mother trying to repair irreparable relationships or the people-pleasing woman afraid of disappointing others. She was someone who had chosen authentic legacy over family approval, principled action over reputation management, meaningful impact over personal comfort. The transformation was complete, visible to everyone who saw her carry herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally learned to live entirely according to her own values. The ripple effects were already beginning and would continue for years. Elena's nonprofit received dozens of partnership applications from organizations wanting to replicate their model. Former defendants started sharing their stories publicly, creating a grassroots movement advocating for compassionate sentencing practices. Young attorneys and social workers reached out asking how to incorporate Emily's approaches into their own work. Emily had lost her career, her family relationships, her social standing, and her public reputation. But she had gained something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that her life's work would continue and expand through Elena, and the hundreds of women whose lives would be transformed by her legacy of compassion and second chances. 6 months after the will reading, Emily Myers sat in a small coffee shop in downtown Portland, reading Elena's latest quarterly report with deep satisfaction. The numbers were extraordinary. With Emily's inheritance, Elena had been able to help over 400 women in the past half year, opening 2 new residential facilities and launching a job training program that was already showing remarkable success rates. Emily's life after transformation wasn't perfect, but it was authentic in ways she'd never experienced before. She lived quietly in her family home, which felt peaceful rather than lonely now that it wasn't filled with the pressure to maintain relationships built on false foundations and conditional love. Her mornings were spent reading, tending her garden, and responding to letters from people whose lives had been touched by her story or her former judicial work. Her afternoons often involved volunteering at Elena's facilities, where she discovered that helping people rebuild their lives was just as fulfilling outside a courtroom as it had been behind the bench. The relationship between Emily and Elena had evolved into something beautiful and unexpected. Not quite mother and daughter, not exactly mentor and student, but something uniquely their own, built on shared values and mutual respect. Elena visited Emily weekly, bringing updates about the women they were helping and seeking advice about program development and expansion. Emily found in Elena the legacy she'd always hoped to create but hadn't known how to define, someone who understood that justice was about possibility rather than punishment, that compassion was a form of strength rather than weakness, that true success was measured in transformed lives rather than accumulated wealth or social status. Richard and Lisa had indeed tied up Emily's will in legal challenges for months, hiring expensive attorneys and expert witnesses to contest every aspect of her estate planning. But ultimately, They lost every court battle, with judges consistently ruling that Emily's mental competency was unquestionable and her right to distribute her wealth according to her values was absolute. The final court judgment was particularly satisfying. The presiding judge ruled that Emily's decision was not only legally sound but demonstrated exceptional clarity about her deepest values and their practical application to create lasting positive impact. The judge noted that Emily's bequest would generate measurable benefits for society in ways that traditional family inheritance could not match. Emily's children had made one final attempt at reconciliation after their complete legal defeat, arriving at her house 6 months later with what they called a mature conversation about family healing. But Emily had grown too much to accept their conditional offers of relationship. When Richard suggested they could move past this unfortunate period if Emily would consider modifying her will to include them more substantially, Emily realized they still fundamentally misunderstood what their conflict had actually been about. This was never about money, Emily told them with patient finality. This was about whether you could love me for who I am rather than who you wanted me to be for your convenience. You've answered that question repeatedly and consistently. I accept your answer, and I hope someday you'll understand mine. Emily reflected often on what she'd learned about strength, courage, and inner peace through her ordeal. Strength, she discovered, wasn't about enduring criticism or maintaining relationships at any cost. It was about having the courage to live according to your values, even when everyone around you thought you were wrong. Real courage wasn't about facing external enemies, but about facing uncomfortable truths about the people you loved most and choosing authenticity over harmony when the two couldn't coexist. And peace didn't come from everyone's approval or universal understanding. It came from the deep satisfaction of knowing your life had made a meaningful difference in the world, regardless of whether that difference was recognized or appreciated by the people whose opinions you'd once prioritized above your own values. The visual callback to Emily's opening hook came during her final scene in this story. She was sitting in the same courthouse where she'd once presided as a judge, this time as a volunteer helping Elena conduct a workshop for women transitioning out of the criminal justice system. Emily watched Elena facilitate the discussion with the same compassionate authority Emily had once brought to her courtroom, and felt the circle of her life completing itself in ways she couldn't have imagined when her judicial career ended in scandal and disgrace. One of the participants, a young woman not much older than Elena had been when she'd first appeared in Emily's courtroom, raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Gonzalez, how do you know when someone really deserves a second chance? How do you tell the difference between people who will change and people who are just saying what you want to hear?" Elena smiled and glanced at Emily before answering, her response carrying wisdom earned through her own transformation and her work with hundreds of other women. Everyone deserves a second chance, regardless of their mistakes or their past. The question isn't about deserving, it's about whether you're ready to do the difficult work required to make that chance count for something meaningful. Emily felt tears of gratitude rather than grief as she recognized her own judicial philosophy living on in Elena's words and work. This was what legacy actually looked like, not money passed down to relatives, but principles passed forward to people who would use them to transform other lives in an expanding circle of positive change. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between family approval and living according to your values? Share your story. This community believes in the power of second chances and authentic legacy. Emily's story ended not with perfect family relationships, public vindication, or restored reputation, but with something more valuable: the deep peace that comes from knowing you've used your life to plant seeds that will grow and spread long after you're gone. She had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable people's worst impulses, even when those people are your own children. She had discovered that true family isn't always defined by blood relationships, but by shared values and mutual commitment to making the world more just and compassionate. The final reflection Emily offered to anyone who would listen was simple but profound. Your legacy isn't what you leave to your family based on biological relationships. It's what you leave in the world based on your deepest values. Choose wisely because those choices will outlive you. Don't forget to subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories for more tales of courage, transformation, and the power of living authentically. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about women who chose principle over popularity, integrity over approval, and meaningful legacy over comfortable conformity. And remember, your story matters too, and your values are worth fighting for.